Hello everyone. As you come in, just to let you know, we're just going to be waiting till 4 p.m. to start. So just waiting a few minutes to make sure everyone has a chance to join. Feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat if you'd like to. Just a bit about where you're from and what you're looking forward to in today's webinar. Okay, so it looks like people are still trickling in. But I think I'll just get started. So welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. So today's talk is with John Stewart, and it's all about mammalian responses to the cold. John is a vertebrate paleontologist with research interests in the responses of vertebrates, including humans, to climate change, such as range change, extinction, macro and microevolution. So before handing over to John, just a few things. If you've got any questions whilst the talk is going, feel free to either put them in the webinar chat or there's a Q&A box at the bottom of the webinar. You can put your questions in there as well. And then once John is finished with his talk, I can read out your questions to him and hopefully get some answers. So with that in mind, let's get started, John.
Okay. Good evening. So yes, as explained, I'm a vertebrate paleontologist. Although I will be talking quite a bit about genetics. I'm rather hoping there aren't any geneticists in the audience because I may struggle a bit if you ask me any detailed questions about that. I work with geneticists rather than being a geneticist myself. So yes, I was asked to talk about mammalian responses to the cold, and I thought the principal area that I'm interested in myself and do research in is the response of mammals to, well, mammals and other vertebrates to long-term climate change. So I thought what I'd do is I'd start off, assuming my slides, whoops, what's happening here? By showing you some slides explaining what I mean by long-term climate change. So over the periods of hundreds of thousands of years, the last 100,000 of years in particular, we have what are called Milankovitch cycles. Milankovitch cycles are climate change on the Ice Age time scale. And these are caused by three different separate perspectives in which the Earth is in relation to the sun. The easiest of these to explain is the eccentricity, which is how close the Earth is to the sun through time. And that works, it says 93,000 on this slide, but approximately 100,000 years. And then there's a progressively smaller scale cycle, which affects climate. So you can imagine the Earth being closer to the sun and then further away from the sun, affecting climate, because the Earth's orbit around the sun goes from a circle to an ellipse and back again. And then there are slightly more difficult concepts to address, which is that there's a 40,000 year axial tilt cycle and there's a precession cycle. Those are to do with the Earth's axis of rotation, how that moves in orientation, and it also wobbles on a 41 and 21,000 year cycle respectively. And those together combine to make what we call the solar forcing prediction from Milankovitch. So if you look at this slide here, you can see the top, which is the 20,000 year cycle, the precession, which is the shortest amplitude, the obliquity, which is the 40,000, and the 100,000. Those combine to make the solar forcing. This is a prediction. This was a mathematically derived prediction of what climate should be. And then eventually, this was actually proven. This was predicted in the 1930s by a chap called Milutin Milankovitch, and was eventually proved using some quite expensive science with drilling cores in the Pacific and deriving oxygen isotopes from foraminifera. I'm not going to explain all that, but basically, those predictions of Milankovitch were proven to be correct. And what you can see here from left to right is present day to 2.6 million years ago, which is the entirety of the last, what we might call the Ice Age or the Pleistocene. And in this picture, you can see peaks and troughs. The peaks are the interglacials and the troughs are the glacials. And of course, what I'm going to be talking about is this, the change from these interglacials, these warmer periods, to these glacial periods. Now, we have actually got a record for this going back much further, all the way back to 5,500 years, 5.5 million years, I should say. And one thing I did want to point out is that you can see from this slide that there are variations in the amplitude. So in the last million or so years, we have a dominance in the cycles of the 100,000 year cycles. And prior to that, it's dominated by the 40,000. And before that, it's much less extreme. And in fact, that's where you get before the Pleistocene, or the period sometimes referred to as the Ice Age. Incidentally, that 40 to 100,000 year change coincided with a lot of evolution of cold adapted species we're now beginning to realize. I shan't be talking about that today. So what happens is, when we're in cold periods, we have these massive downturns in temperature, and we have buildup of ice. It starts off as snow, it compacts, it turns into ice, and turns into ice sheets that then spread from the poles. And here you can see Europe, and the blue, of course, is an ice sheet from about the time of the height of the last ice age, approximately 20,000 years ago. You see much of Britain is covered in ice, Scandinavia is completely covered, and some other parts of Europe. South of that, you get tundra and steppe and forest. But that's basically the situation. It's cold, and conditions are not very conducive for life. Although, as I shall explain, this may be slightly oversimplified. There are other periods during the ice ages where things are not as extreme as that. And in this picture, I'm afraid it's a slightly different looking picture. You can see the ice at the top forming across Scandinavia, but the rest, it hasn't spread south as far. It certainly hasn't spread south in Britain. This is actually a period before the height of the last ice age, 30,000 years ago. But this is another type of condition that can exist during the glacial periods. And as you can see, you have steppe tundra as opposed to tundra. This is a fairly rich version. You have coniferous forest below that, and then the mixed conifer and deciduous forest below that. And of course, then you have the kind of vegetation that we would have today in Europe, had we not cut down a lot of the trees. You can see the tundra to the far north in the northern Norway, boreal forest below that, cool temperate forest, and then Mediterranean vegetation further south, the red. And then to the east, we have the moist and dry steppe, which I'll come to a little bit later. So you can see that these dramatic climate cycles affect the vegetation in quite an important way. And as you can imagine, it affects where mammals will live during these climate cycles. Now, one thing to note is that Eurasia has got this very peculiar thing, which is that we have, during the modern era, we have these almost striped horizontal bands of vegetation. Now, that's something that didn't really exist at the height of the last ice age, and certainly before, during the slightly warmer parts of the ice age. All of that was disruptive and probably enabled things like the mammoth to survive, because it was a very rich and varied vegetation. So as you go from the north down to the south, of course, today you have tundra, as you can see in the left-hand picture, and taiga or boreal forest in the right-hand picture. And then as you go further south again, you have what we would recognize as the deciduous broadleaf forest that we would see in Britain today. The species that you would expect during these different climate times, during interglacials, so this is a picture, a reconstruction of the kinds of species that would have been around during the last interglacial, so not the one that we're in at the moment. And you can see a mixture of species that you'll recognize, like the red deer in the background, and the fallow deer skull towards the front, as well as spotted hyena, hippos, and then extinct species like the straight-tusked elephant and one of the Stephanorhinos in the background there. So familiar things, less familiar things, and extinct things. Species that have moved, like the hyena and the hippo, and then extinct things. The cold periods, by contrast, would have had a much more open habitat and would have had what we call the steppe tundra, and would have supported a lot of herbivores and carnivores to go with them. You can see a wolverine to the front there with mammoth family and some horses to the background. In other words, this would have been a very rich environment with lots of herbivores, but in an open grassland type steppe tundra environment. So that's the kinds of things that goes on as a consequence of those climate changes that in turn are driven by these Milankovitch cycles. So when you think about the responses of a species to the cycles that I've just talked about, there are various ways that species can respond generally. There's behavioral modifications, which of course I'm not going to talk about, and they are a little bit difficult to recognize in the fossil record, as you might expect. Geographical range change, which is going to be the principal topic of this talk. Extinction, evolution, both macro and micro, so that's both species and above and subspecific level evolution, and then ecomorphological change, which is something we're slowly finding out is much more common than previously thought. There are species in the past that have different shape, but genetically they're not different. So this is something that we have to keep an eye out when we're studying changes through time. So geographical range change is what I principally want to talk about. So one thing to mention about this is that when species ranges change, they can either expand or they can contract. And when they're in their extreme contraction phase, we would say they're in refugium. They're living in a refugium or refugia, plural. And this is during the times when that particular species finds it hardest to live. And just to explain that in a slightly simplistic way, but to make the point, when you have more individuals, your range expands, because this isn't so much, this isn't migration in the sense of seasonal migration. This is how many individuals, and you spill over into greater area if the climate conditions are good and they're reproducing a lot, they're producing lots of individuals, the range has to expand. Similarly, when you get less individuals and the external edges die out, the range contracts into refugium. And of course, the most extreme version of this is extinction, when there are no species, no individuals left at all. So to use this set of fairly straightforward slides, you've got a species in refugium, you get more and more individuals, they're breeding, the conditions are good for that particular species, so they can't all live in that small area, so they have to expand with the number of individuals. And the opposite is also true. But that reduction in area is accompanied by death of individuals as you contract into an area where conditions are more favorable. And this is just to make the point that certainly on this long-term climate scale type phenomenon here, when you lose all your individuals, you're extinct. And this is just to make a very simple point that it's on a continuum when we look at this time scale. It's on a continuum of range change. So one thing that's really important to note at this stage is that species are individualistic. And what that means is that they respond as individuals and not as ecological communities as climate change. And this means that not all species will have the same identical refugium, and they will respond according to their own ecological requirements. And this also means that some species will be in refugium during cold phases, the temperate species, for example, species that live in the kind of latitudes of Britain today. They don't like it during glacial time, so they will contract. Conversely, Arctic and tundra species, they like it when it's cold during glacial periods, and their ranges will expand. They will expand south. And certainly Arctic fox and reindeer would have lived in Britain during these colder times. And of course, what that also means is they are in refugium today. They're in refugium during the interglacial that we're in at the moment. So there are different ways of studying geographic range change. There's biogeography, which is essentially looking at geographical distributions of species and inferring what may have happened. There's the fossil record that gives us some time depth, which can confirm some of the biogeographic assumptions. And then we've got the more recent science of phylogeography, which I shall talk about a bit more length. So, as I say, biogeography, you can take a species, say a cold adapted species like an Arctic hare or mountain hare, as you can see in the bottom right hand corner, and to the left you can see its geographic range today. You can see that it's got a relict distribution. It's got pockets that are separated from each other, particularly the alpine population. The alpine population is likely to have been attached to the more northern populations in former times. And if you look at the fossil record, this ellipse I've drawn on this figure is the approximate range of the Arctic hare during the late Pleistocene, during the late Ice Age, the last glacial period. They reached as far south as northern Spain. And so the alpine British and Scandinavian and Russian populations would have been in contact during this time. The Scandinavian actually may have been contracted somewhat with the expanded ice sheet, of course. But it goes to show that with the fossil record, you can confirm what you might assume from just modern maps of the distribution of a species. So next we come to the science of phylogeography, which is a science that arose due to the ability of studying DNA. I think it was a term coined in the late 80s by John Avis in America. It's a way of connecting the phylogenetic tree, the relationship tree of a species, with its geographical distribution. And it's not dissimilar to what I've just shown you, but it's looking at a species in more detail, looking at the variation within species and using that variation to infer what may have happened over time. The most common markers are used are the variable regions of mitochondrial DNA. These are parts of the DNA strand that vary within a species, so that you can look at how variable a species is. And you can use this data to infer species histories, and in particular, changes in population size and colonization route, which is what I'm going to talk about. You can also use it to identify evolutionary significant units. And sorry, my dog is barking at me. I'm going to lift it out. Sorry about that. You can use the reasoning that I'm talking about to identify populations that may be more or less at risk to ongoing climate change, future climate change, which is something that we are concerned with. So, as I said, you can use the phylogeographic data, data of mitochondrial DNA, to infer where populations of species lived in the past. And I'll explain it with, first of all, this map from Godfrey Hewitt from his Nature paper in the year 2000, which showed for Europe the three principal areas of refugium, being Iberia, Italy, and the Balkans. And those areas were the places that temperate species, warm-loving species, would have were thought by him and others to have been contracted into during the last ice age. And those arrows are actually inferred rather than observed, and I'll explain. So there were different patterns that were defined according to genetic data of different types of organisms. So there was the grasshopper, the hedgehog, and the bear pattern, which were the three kind of model patterns that he defined in that paper. You can see the grasshopper comes dominantly out of the Balkans and spreads right across Europe. The Iberian and Italian populations don't leave those areas. The hedgehog pattern comes out of all three southern refugial areas, and the bear comes out of the eastern and the western refugia, respectively, although the bear comes out of an area slightly north of the Balkan refugium. So these were the patterns that he identified, and I'll explain how. The idea was that these populations that are now found in more northern areas were contracted during the height of the Ice Age into these southern areas, as you can see in the map on the left, and they expanded northward subsequently after about 12,000 years ago. So if you look at the brown bear, I'll explain that in more detail. So you can see here a phylogenetic tree, a genetic tree, a relationship tree of populations of bear genetics with different genetics. You can see the Spanish and Swedish bear are related very closely. So if you look at this part of this genetic tree, they fall in the same part of the tree. The Balkans and the Italians fall in this purple part of the tree, and the red part of the tree is that area north of the Balkans, right up into Lapland and Norway. And so that's the pattern that you can see today. It doesn't actually tell you anything about movement. It's just looking at the relationships of things and where they are on the map today. These genetic types, it's all the same species, but they're different populations, they're different genetic populations of brown bear. And the movements are simply inferred because of the assumption that these populations would have been pushed all the way south when it was cold. The movement north is inferred. It's an assumption based on the fact that they shouldn't be able to live in the north. So that's where you get these arrows from. These arrows are assumptions simply based on, as I say, these perceptions that species couldn't live to the north during the last cold stage. The colonization of the north was done by a process called leading edge dispersal, or leptokurtic dispersal. And this is a figure from another one of Godfrey Hewitt's papers showing that the north, you can see far less variation in the north and much more variation in the south. The south is where the refugia are and the populations that would have contracted, and then they expand northwards. And not all the populations managed to get all the way to the north. Some of them, two of them reach all the way to the north, and many of them their movement north is impeded partly by meeting these other populations. Leptokurtic dispersal. Now, when we think about temperate species, as I say, we have this assumption that that they moved north subsequent to the last ice age. But the fossil record actually tells us something different. The fossil record actually tells us that some of these species were already in the north. And this slide is from a paper that myself and Adrian Lister wrote some time ago, proposing this idea of cryptic northern refugia. And you can see those two star-shaped patterns, which is this additional idea for temperate species that may have lived in more temperate places during the cold, possibly in something like this. This is the Belgian Ardennes. This is a deeply incised valley that may have had microclimates to allow these species to survive during these cold periods. And there was various forms of fossil evidence that we used, including small mammal evidence, red deer evidence, charcoal evidence from temperate trees, to suggest that these cryptic northern refugia existed. And since that time, quite a lot of evidence has come forward to demonstrate this. These are quite old now, but these were some of the first papers that came out demonstrating that these cryptic northern refugia were a real thing, both evidence from charcoal, evidence from phylogeography of small mammals, including this being the common vole. There was evidence found amongst seaweed genetics in the Channel, common frog, cryptic northern refugium north of the southern refugia in both Switzerland and Ireland. And lots of different species were found to have evidence for this, particularly from phylogeographic studies, because that paper that I just talked about was particularly successful in getting phylogeographers to look for evidence for this alternative explanation for what had been going on since the last ice age. But of course, that refugia for temperate species during cold stages, there is that other flip side to this coin, which is what happens to cold adapted species. In this slide, you can see some photographs of some Arctic. There's a collared lemming, a Arctic fox, and the rock and willow ptarmigan. These are all species that are in refugium today, and they had their maximum geographic ranges during the last ice age and reached places like northern Spain, as I mentioned to you before. So, of course, this is part of this individualism. Individualism, of course, is one of the reasons that not all species have exactly the same geographic ranges. In fact, very few have. But of course, this is the complication. This individualism means that that not all species have the same refugium, and of course, it's not even just that some are in refugium during the glacials and some are in refugium during the interglacials. It's also the variation within the more cold and the more warm adaptive species. There is variation between those categories as well, of course. So if you think of the refugia for temperate species, you can see on this picture the southern refugia, which we're not contesting, but you can see some cryptic northern refugia mentioned on this slide, depicted on this slide. And then you've got the interglacial refugia, like today, where you've got whole species, such as the Arctic fox, the lemmings, etc., that are in refugium today because they don't like it in the warm. And of course, there are also southern populations of those up mountains, and we call those cryptic southern refugium as a kind of an addition to the equivalent of the cryptic northern refugia for temperate species. So yes, if you look at the Arctic fox, it has this much greater distribution during the ice ages and would have reached all the way down to southern France, across most of Britain, whereas now it's in this very much more restricted Arctic distribution today. Other species, as I've already mentioned before, have these cryptic southern refugia, such as the Arctic hare in the Alps today. But then there's another dimension to this, which is that during the Ice Age, there's also an expansion of continental species towards the oceans, because the oceans have a big effect on climate. During the glacials, the effect of the oceans is diminished, and so continental species expand from the center of continents towards the edges. And this species here, the ground squirrel, the European ground squirrel, is found all the way across Europe, expanded from these more eastern steppic places that you find them contracted towards today. That's because the steppe expands and the tundra expands. This is why we talk about the steppe tundra in the late Pleistocene. So if you go back to this picture, we can add to that. During the interglacials, we have refugia for these continental species. And potentially we also have cryptic oceanic refugia for these continental species as well. Or that's something we speculated about, but haven't found much evidence for. So on this slide here, we can see the different types of refugia that we define. This is myself, Lou Vidal, and Adrian Lister, and Ian Barnes back in 2010. And this lists the various types of refugia that I've just mentioned. Refugia for temperate species during glacials, the southern refugia, the cryptic northern refugia, the refugia for cold taxa during interglacials, such as today, the polar refugia for things like the reindeer and the Arctic fox, etc. And then the cryptic southern refugia for the species that are up high on mountains in southern areas. And then we have the continental adapted species that are in refugium today during this interglacial, such as continental refugia for things like the ground squirrel, Saiga antelope that was also expanded during the Ice Age, and steppe pika, for example. And then we've speculated that there may be cryptic refugia for continental species as well during interglacials. So this picture here shows all the various types of refugia that we proposed in this 2010 paper. That's just listing all the types of refugia and the dates and papers that during which they were defined. Now, one thing about these refugia is that they're not necessarily occupied for similar amounts of time. And an important part about this is that these refugia can have an important role in evolution. And glacials are longer than interglacials, which is a really important thing for evolution. As you can see, the long duration refugia are the southern refugia, for warm species, because their refugia during these long glacials for temperate species, but also these smaller populations in these cryptic northern refugia. The short duration refugia are such as the polar refugia for things like the Arctic fox today, or the cryptic southern refugia for species stuck on top of mountains like the Arctic hare or various plants, and ptarmigan, for example. So how evolution is going to affect the species, the duration of refugia is going to affect the evolution of species. Well, we will expect that cold adapted species should generally display less population divergence than temperate species. Populations in cryptic refugia have the highest potential for rapid evolution because they're small populations. Small populations are more prone to diverge than large populations. So one scenario that we evoked was that cryptic northern refugia may have been important for the evolution of cold adapted species. They include small population sizes. There are different selective pressures because there are populations in the north in different environmental conditions. And there's also possibility for a phenomenon that I'm not going to talk about in great detail called the new neighbor hypothesis, which is that populations mix up, the species compositions mix up when you rearrange where species are on the map. They tend to end up in different combinations, which is probably also another pressure. So this can lead to isolation of temperate populations in these cryptic northern refugia, which in turn may be the origin of some of these Arctic species. So for example, the Arctic fox probably evolved from the swift fox, and the brown bear probably led to the polar bear. These are the respective closest relatives to these Arctic species. The swift fox and the brown bear are respectively the closest genetic relatives to the Arctic hare, the Arctic fox and the polar bear. So it's likely that a population of these more temperate species was found itself in a northern cryptic refugia and became exposed to these cold conditions and evolved into these more Arctic adapted species. As I say, there is a consequence of this geographical range change to ecological communities. I've just mentioned it, and that is that you get these what we call non-analog or disharmonious ecological communities. Because things are rearranging through these climate cycles, you end up with different species combinations, and you can get species living together in the past that don't live together today, don't live in sympatry today, and because of that, it looks like they shouldn't be able to live together in terms of their climate correlates today. So, for example, you regularly find Arctic fox and ground squirrel together in the past. And it's this kind of thing that may have been part of the evolutionary pressure on species during the evolution of cold adapted species that I was talking about earlier, the new neighbor hypothesis. Again, this was an idea proposed by Godfrey Hewitt some years ago. So what I wanted to talk about next, assuming I've got time, is the use of ancient DNA and what that has shown us about all of these processes. So what you can do with ancient DNA is you can take the fossils and work out how they relate to these phylogeographic populations that we see today. So we can look at whether or not when climate changed, whether populations moved with the climate, what we call habitat tracking, or whether those expanded populations went extinct. Those being the two alternatives when you go from an expanded population of a cold species, such as the Arctic fox, contracting into the northern populations we see today. And when you take the genetics from these long dead ice age populations of Arctic fox, you find that you have very different populations from the ones in Scandinavia today. If you look at these spider-like diagrams, these are demonstrating how much variation, genetic variation, there is in different populations of Arctic fox. The two on the left are Scandinavia 100 years ago and Scandinavia today. They're more or less the same. And the one on the bottom is from these various southern located ice age populations in Belgium, in Germany, and in Russia. And you can see there's a whole part of the variation. So basically how these diagrams work is the closer these dots are, the more closely related those samples are. The size of it is how many individuals. And you can see there's whole parts of this spider-like diagram that are not represented in the north today. Now this implies that the Arctic foxes in the north did not come from the south. These southern populations went extinct. These northern ones in Scandinavia, when Scandinavia had been covered in ice at the time that these southern populations were living, probably expanded from Siberia. You can see the genetic variation in Siberia today that is very similar to Scandinavia. So they didn't come from the south. So they did not track climate as climate warmed since the last ice age. Those southern populations went extinct. So to look at a different species, we can look at the collared lemming. A collared lemming today doesn't even live in Europe. It lives to the east in Siberia. There's a picture of a collared lemming there to the bottom right, and there's a picture of a cave that I've been excavating in Belgium for the last 20 or so years. This is a picture of the stratigraphy of the cave, and to show you that we've got quite a lot of time depth going down from 41,000 all the way up to the Neolithic, but certainly up to 14,000 towards the end of the last ice age. And we took a lot of samples of these collared lemmings, and you can see a collared lemming jaw to the left, and you can see the numbers and the layers that we got them from. And we produced this. This was in a paper in 2012, where we found that there was correspondence between the genetic populations and the depth and the age of the samples. So if you look at this, we've got couche, which of course is French for layer, 16 at the bottom, and that's lineage 1. Lineage 2 was from a different cave, but differently aged. And then lineage 3 was from 3 different layers, but generally younger again. So as you go up in this picture of the phylogenetic relationships, you can see they're getting younger until you get to that dotted line, and above that, the population that you're looking at is still extant, and it's related to the Siberian ones. And I'm not explaining it very well, but what I'm trying to tell you is that there is a relationship between age and the different types of population that we have. And this is the carbon dating that was done on those samples. And what we think was going on is that we have different populations living and then going extinct, and then a new population arrives, that goes extinct, and then a new population arrived, that goes extinct, and so on. And each of those extinctions, and this is a figure here showing you climate, this is ice core data this time, showing you, this is stadials and interstadials. So this is warm and cold periods within the last glacial. And you'll note A, B, C are clustered around warm interstadials. And what we think is, so population 1, lineage 1, was alive before A. It went extinct when it warmed up, because of course vegetation would have changed, and the lemmings wouldn't have survived. And then a new population arrived, lineage 2, and then that went extinct, and so on and so forth. So what's interesting about this is it starts to show us that these patterns that we're trying to talk about, looking at using phylogeography, are very, very simplified. They're very simplified because there's a lot more dynamism going on during these warm and cold periods than we would otherwise know about just looking at the fossils, and certainly just looking at the modern geographic maps. So this has to be borne in mind when we think about these kinds of processes, how organisms are responding to these long-term climate oscillations. And so what we think is going on, we think the populations in the West are recurrently going extinct, and they're being replaced by further populations of collared lemmings that are coming in from the East. We don't know at the moment where they're coming from, but that's the likely scenario, given that's where they seem to be holed up at the moment. So can we apply this to humans? Well, some time ago, I wrote a paper with Chris Stringer at the Natural History Museum about this kind of science and how it applies to humans. And if you can look at this figure here, it was looking at modern humans and Neanderthals predominantly. And if you go from that bottom map to the top map, you can see modern humans contracted into Africa, where we originated, but expanding out during this warm period during marine isotope stage 5, which was an interglacial. Expanding out and overlapping with the Neanderthals. The Neanderthals are doing well, they expanded, the blue range all across Eurasia. Then we come into a cold phase, the MIS4 phase, and you can see a small contraction of the Neanderthals, and the modern humans have contracted all the way back into Africa. Then we get into stage 3, where modern humans, this is when we actually left Africa and spread all over the world. And you can see the the orange all the way across Eurasia, overlapping with the Neanderthals who subsequently went extinct. And you can also see the Denisovans there to the right, the yellow distribution. And then by the time you reach marine isotope stage 2, it's just modern humans left. But you can see there is some kind of relationship between climate and these expansions and contractions seen in humans. And in fact, if you look at the times during which humans occupied Britain through the long climate change that's taken place over the last several 100,000 years, all the fossils and indeed human artifacts correspond to times of interglacials. And it's only during the last glacial that humans seem to have been able to cope with much colder conditions. There's various human occupations depicted here through time, and each of those big sort of ellipses, horizontal ellipses, coincides with a human occupation during an interglacial in Britain. And this is data from the Leverhulme funded AHOB, Ancient Human Occupation of Britain project. But we think that actually this process, this refugium process, was really important in the evolution of humans. We think it's how Neanderthals evolved from their predecessor, probably in a refugial area. And in fact, we think refugia is where the hybridization took place between us and Neanderthals. We think it's where Neanderthals evolved, and we think they likely went extinct in a refugium, because of course, this is places where contraction takes place. Yeah, and if two populations are contracted, then they're likely to interbreed in such a situation. Although I'm about to show you something else, I'm running out of time. So what happened was, because of that work with Chris Stringer, I then hatched a plan to look at humans, modern humans, in relation to other mammals. And together with Oxala Garcia, my PhD student, who finished some time ago, although we just published the paper, he basically did a meta-analysis of all the available genetic data of the best represented mammals in Europe. And he used mitochondrial control region sequences, and he looked at diversity in mammals seen in the modern patterns to try and classify humans with the different mammals that had sufficient data. Now, with humans, we didn't use modern data because humans have moved around too much, so we used Paleolithic and Mesolithic data, of which there is quite a lot now. So we took the 225 odd mammals of Britain, we limited it to terrestrial species, we excluded bats, and we needed just species that had good geographic distributions, otherwise it was confounding. So we ended up with 23 species, and they all had at least 50 individuals. So here's the list of the species. I'm not going to go through them. And basically, we looked at the genetic variation seen in these different species today and where that variation was. I'm not going to explain the come on, go away. Sorry, my dog. And what we found was that we found 4 different patterns of distribution of variation. And these confirmed the different move the picture of myself because I can't say that these confirmed the different patterns that have been described. So we found the east-west pattern in map A, although the orange species, the stoat, have an anomalous high diversity in Britain. So these circles, the bigger they are, the more diverse that population of those species are. So there's different species in each of these maps. The species in map A include things like I think it's red deer, stoat and weasel, lynx, and the further east they were, the more variation they had. And as you go west, they had less variation. So this seemed to confirm that east-west dimension that I talked about earlier. Then we had the western central belt, which seemed to be some of these cryptic northern refugial species, where the greatest variation seemed to be actually in the north, not in the south. And that includes things like red squirrel and hedgehog. And then to the bottom left, we have the pattern seen in roe deer and um, uh, wild boar, which is the southern refugial pattern, the one that Godfrey Hewitt talked about. And again, you can see the diversity of those is greatest in the south, and it decreases as you go north. And then to our surprise, we found a fourth pattern, one that we tried to eliminate on various occasions, but we found one where we didn't seem to see any pattern at all, what we called the homogeneous pattern, or the no pattern pattern, as I used to call it. And that included a variety of species, including brown bear, wolf, and modern humans. The two different modern humans shown there are the Mesolithic and Upper Paleolithic modern human data. There was no sense that you had greater variation in the south than in the north, and this implies that they were everywhere all the way through the climate, the cold climate of the last ice age into the present period. This was a surprise, and this led to various press releases about how actually humans were very resilient to climate. It's probably not a coincidence that they're accompanying wolf and brown bear being quite omnivorous carnivores, and we are very similar in that regard. This was not something I was expecting based on the work I'd done with Chris Stringer. And I think actually that's my last slide. I'm sorry I sped up quite a lot towards the end because I was running out of time. So I think that's the last slide. Some acknowledgements to Lova Darlen's lab in Sweden and Uppsala, and too many colleagues to talk about who've contributed data and knowledge. That's me.
Thank you. That was really interesting. Yeah, super interesting. So if anyone's got any questions for you, John, before we call it there, I think we've still got about 10 minutes left of the webinar. Feel free to put your questions in the chat and in the Q&A. I don't think we've got any at the moment, so I might just ask you one first, if that's all right. Yeah, I was just wondering if you've got any predictions for the next few thousand years with regards to how different species ranges will shift and which will sort of emerge or go into refugium. Don't know if you've thought about that at all.
Yes, I have. I mean, I was involved in a project some time ago thinking about this. I mean, so we are in an interglacial. We're approximately 10,000 years into it. It's not likely to last. Well, it's likely to last no more than 10 more thousand years, 10 further thousand years. In terms of the processes I'm talking about, not. However, what this work does show is that it really emphasizes very, very strongly that the cold adapted species are going to be very vulnerable to climate change. This isn't rocket science, it's obvious, but it's very clear to see what happens. You know, when climate warms, species contract in the direction that suits them. And in Britain, we have cold adapted species in Scotland, and they are disappearing up the side of the mountains. Things like the ptarmigan, for example. It's not unlikely that we would lose some of these species if climate warms and continues to warm as we know it is. So, and of course, what's interesting about that is that by the time we get back to the next glacial cycle, we won't have any. If we're not careful, we won't have any cold things to expand again. I mean, obviously, this is quite a long time from now, and hard to kind of prioritize. But still, it's an issue. We could be dramatically affecting how these patterns can change in the future.
Yeah, that's not great, is it? Well, thank you. So Julie asks if they were wondering whether you use the research you've done to inform current conservation efforts, or is the scale of the research processes much too large?
So yes, I mean, I was involved with one study of the water vole, and we found two. Well, there had already been two genetic populations of water vole identified in Britain. And there's a Scottish one, there's an English one. And the Scottish one seems to be the one that was in Britain during the last ice age. And it's contracted, and the English one has arrived and moved north and pushed the other one south. Sorry, the southern one has pushed up and the Scottish one has contracted. And of course, this is what I said earlier about identifying evolutionary significant units, this idea that we don't just worry about conserving species, we worry about conserving important genetically distinct populations. So for example, that I would suggest is likely to be an evolutionary significant unit. We haven't, I have talked to people about it, but no one seemed to have paid much attention to it. But yes, things like that can be important. My dog's barking at me, sorry. Let me just open the door.
Yeah, no worries. Right, I don't think we've got any other questions coming in. Oh, wait, never mind. We do have one. So Isabel asks, do you have any ideas for your next project or what you want this research to go on to?
Well, actually, what I'm doing now is I mentioned Love Dahlen and his paleogenetics team in Sweden. We're actually starting to study ancient DNA of species going backwards much further in time, so that we're not just looking at what happens between the last glacial and the interglacial we're in. We're looking at more than one cycle. And of course, that's going to be tremendously interesting. And we're likely to start seeing, you know, evolutionary changes and processes that are not visible on the scale that I've been principally looking at has been the last 50,000 years, but we're talking several 100,000 years, which gives us, takes us beyond the last interglacial that was about 100,000 years ago, 120,000 years ago. So yes, it's gonna, we can start looking at all sorts of processes, and undoubtedly there'll be surprises. We're looking at lemmings, we're looking at water voles, mammoths, lots of species. Exciting stuff. The ability to get DNA out of older and older fossils is the exciting cutting edge of that science. I don't do the DNA. I just help provide the fossils and discuss the results.
Yeah, that sounds really exciting.
Yes, definitely. Yes.
Yeah, I think, well,
Oh, lots of people asking questions. Oh, they're just saying thank you, right?
yeah, just saying thank you. Yeah, I don't think any more questions are coming in. So is there any sort of last thing you'd like to say or sort of advertise, any publications or anything you can guide people to reading about this subject?
I could I forward the last paper, maybe one or two others to you, and then maybe you can offer it for dissemination.
Yeah, I'll send it to everyone who's signed up.
Okay. All right then.
Right. Oh, there is like one more question. I think we still got
Oh,
a couple minutes. Sorry, one more that's just come in. Isabel asks, are there any species you are most excited for?
um, yeah. I not exactly. I mean, yeah, water vole in so much that we've actually collected the biggest set of samples for any ancient DNA study yet. So that's going to be exciting. But actually, in many ways, it's not just individual species; it's comparing them. We've also worked on ptarmigan, which I mentioned earlier, and they do habitat track. They do contract north as the climate warms. So you're seeing different patterns in different types of organisms. Um, it may be that birds are able to do that because they're more mobile. And I think it's only by looking at these various ecological species that we can get a fuller idea of what's going on. But yeah, the water vole, because we've got a vast data, set of samples.
Right. Sorry, another question's just come in. Just I've got a couple minutes, so we'll fit this last one. In Zara asks, is it possible to know how much has been explored about the longitudinal movements of species in response to glacial and interglacial cycles? Is this common in polar and temperate zones?
I didn't really understand the question. Are you talking about the east-west dimension, or do you mean latitudinal? Sorry, I didn't.
Yeah,
I
no,
I think you may have meant. I'm looking for the. Where is it? Is it in Q&A or in
Yeah,
chat?
it's just in the chat. Yeah, if you scroll up. East to west, they say.
Oh, okay. Can't see the question. Sorry, I just want to look at it.
Yeah, no worries. If you scroll up a little bit, it's
Well, longitude. Yeah, I mean, we haven't actually studied any of these sort of steppe species yet. Some people have done phylogeography of things like the ground squirrel and mentioned some of our predictions, but no one's done any ancient DNA on these east-west dimension species. So, I mean, yes, that is definitely something someone needs to do. We can't do everything, of course. This science is quite expensive.
yeah. Great. Well, to those of you asking about recordings, so this is going to be uploaded to YouTube, but not publicly, but I'll send you all a link. So you should be able to access it for the next few weeks if you want to rewatch, if you've had laptop crashes, etc. So yeah, thank you so much, John. Unless there's anything last minute words you want to say, or anything else, I think we'll end it there.
No, thank you very much. So, yeah, okay, brilliant.
Great. Well, it's great having you on. Yeah, thank you. Have
Okay,
a
bye
nice
bye.
day, everyone. Bye.
Bye.